The Torah portion about the Abraham Accords. How many of you watched the signing ceremony at the White House as the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel took a great step forward for peace in the Middle East? It's a very important moment, and those were the remarks I had prepared for today. And then last night, we got word that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away. An astounding woman whose career spanned many years as a lawyer, as a teacher of law, and as a Supreme Court justice for 27 of those years. So today I'm about to do something that in over 40 years, speaking on Rosh Hashanah, I have never done before. I'm setting aside my prepared remarks, and instead, I'm just going to share a few thoughts about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. After hearing of her passing last night, I woke up this morning thinking, how would she, a professor of law, a Supreme Court justice, read the Torah portion that we read this morning? It's a story we know so well. Story of Abraham and Sarah, and the birth of Isaac, and then Abraham's difficult decision to follow Sarah's request and send Hagar and Ishmael away because she doesn't like the way that Ishmael is playing with her son Isaac. And so this concubine slave woman Hagar is sent off into the desert with her son. And the boy and she nearly die in that desert. But God intercedes and they're saved. And then we read the story of an ancient pact, which some have referred to as the first Abraham Accord, a pact between Abraham and Avimelech regarding water rights and pasture rights and land rights in the ancient Middle East. So what would have interested Ruth Bader Ginsburg? First of all, as a champion of women's rights, she should surely and would surely have been interested in the difficult situation in which Hagar found herself. Hagar had legal rights. According to the great Bible scholar Nahum Sarna, with whom I was privileged to study at Brandeis University, Hagar had rights as a concubine. She was more than a slave. She had a status different from a simple slave in Abraham's household. And of course, so did her son, Ishmael. One of the commentaries on this, written by Sarna, suggests that Sarah's motivation for wanting Ishmael sent away was because, as she says in the text, he should not inherit with my son Isaac. You see, because Ishmael was a son of Abraham, and because of Hagar's status as a concubine, he had inheritance rights. Abraham considered him a full son, and that changed his legal status in the world, the legal world of the ancient Middle East. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a champion of women's rights, would have been very interested in that. And we can trace an arc from this story and its implications for our understanding of the status of women in law in the ancient Middle East, right through Torah and through many of the texts and experiences that women had with law throughout the ages, right to our modern era. I also think that she would have been very interested in the situation of Hagar and Ishmael because of her deep devotion not only to women's rights, but human rights. As Hillary Clinton is famous for having once said, human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights. And that, of course, is true. But I think that she would have been interested also in the fact that Hagar, as we've discussed before, has a name that's related to the Hebrew word ger, which means stranger. She was, if you will, a resident alien. And of course, her status in that regard triggers in us today the concern that we have for those who have the status of legal or illegal immigrants in this country. We can trace the treatment of the stranger right through the Torah. It comes out of the Jewish experience and is reflected then in Jewish law. The experience is, of course, being strangers in the land of Egypt, and then, after having gone from that slavery to freedom, the Torah says no fewer than 36 times that we are to be concerned about the rights of the stranger. Ger yatom va'almanah, the stranger, the orphan, the widow, those who may fall to the lowest strata of society economically, have to be treated with respect, dignity, and be protected by the law. V'ahavta et hager, we're even told in the Torah that we are to find a way to love them. And that statement is made even before we hear, V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, you shall love the Lord your God. This would surely have interested Ruth Bader Ginsburg because of her concern for human rights, for civil rights, for the rights of those most in danger in any society. But there's more still. You know, I was going to talk about this story of Avimelech as the first Abraham Accord, or one of the first Abraham Accords. And I think that she would have found that interesting as well. Interesting because the word that's used there for that accord in the text of the Torah is brit, a covenant. And a covenant is something that's very familiar to us. We talk about Abraham's covenant with God as the first covenant, a covenant that's made at Sinai through Moses and the giving of the commandments. Our whole relationship with God as a people is defined by that term, brit, covenant, pact, compact, treaty. It's interpreted in many ways and translated in many ways. Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have found that word fascinating because of the many ways in which it's applied. But for us, I think, we have to recognize that the first Abraham Accord, the first Abraham Brit, is with God. And at the very end of the portion that we're going to read today, you'll see that the words in the second to last verse are words with which Abraham refers to God as Adonai El Olam, Lord, and El Olam can be translated in a couple of ways. God of the world, literally, or everlasting or eternal God, more literally, which is the translation that our Machzor uses. This is the only place in the entire Bible that refers to God in that way. Right at the conclusion of the story that we're going to read from Torah today. God is El Olam, God of the whole world. That fits beautifully with Rosh Hashanah, which is, according to tradition, the anniversary of creation. God is the God of all of the world, and of course that means the God of all who are in this world. God's concern is for all people, all peoples, all nations. And in that sense, the reference to this pact signed at the White House as the Abraham Accords is very apt, because it's about peace. It's about people coming together. And it's enshrined in a compact, in an accord, in a covenant, in a treaty. That's how people make peace legally. But that legal peace reflects a theological understanding of El Olam, God of the world. And it reflects the relationship that we as a people want to underscore and explore even more deeply and consider in our minds and hearts on Rosh Hashanah. It reflects a sense that we, in establishing our particular covenant with God, our particular brit, are seeking a relationship that gives us a mission in the world. That too comes out of the story of Abraham's life. Abraham knew what it was like to be an immigrant, to go from one place to another. Abraham knew what it was like to have to fight wars. Abraham knew what it meant to face famine and want. Abraham experienced all of that, and so did our people throughout the ages. And we drew upon that experience. Ruth Bader Ginsburg drew on her life experiences as well. She said very beautifully and meaningfully in one of the speeches she made, how long does it take to go from an immigrant garment worker to a Supreme Court justice? And her answer was, 1 generation, because that was her life experience. That was her family experience. And she brought that experience to her understanding of law and how it should be applied. That reference to the covenant at the end of the story, in referring to God as El Olam, the eternal God, tells us that there are eternal truths. Abraham understood those truths. He was kind to strangers and welcomed them into his tent when they were in need. He fought even with God, challenged God for justice for Sodom and Gomorrah. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Justice, kindness, caring, concern, love of the stranger, treatment of women and children, all enshrined in Torah, all enshrined in law. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg would have appreciated that. And one final thought. Today, Rosh Hashanah is referred to as Yom Hadin, the Day of Judgment. Picture in your mind the scene in the stained glass window to the right over here. The Rosh Hashanah stained glass window has scales of justice right at the top of it. But even more, the Talmud tells us, just as we pray on Rosh Hashanah, this Yom Hadin, this day of judgment, God too prays. And the Talmud asks, what is God's prayer? God prays, Yehi Ratzon. May it be my will, God, may it be my will that I move from the throne of justice to the throne of mercy. Just as we would like not only judgment that's fair, we want judgment that's merciful, that's compassionate, that's caring. Ruth Bader Ginsburg would certainly have appreciated that story. And I think that it's important that we take this moment to appreciate her. I believe there are many more ways to read the passage that we're about to encounter here in the Machzor. I'm conscious of the fact that 3 people within this congregation chose to create depictions of Ruth Bader Ginsburg on holiday heads, which are here in the congregation looking at me. I hope you will take time to reflect on how you feel she might have read this passage of Torah. And then this afternoon at 3 o'clock on Zoom, we can come together to discuss it, and maybe the Abraham Accords as well. The Torah reading for today is on page 202 of your Machzorim. Madeline Baer, Jason Glassman, Hallie Jason, Sarah Arnstein, Gabriel Matro, and Alexa Gershon will read excerpts of the full Kriyah. First, let's recite together the blessing over the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with mitzvot and instructed us to engage in words of Torah. Shana Tova.